Welcome, everybody, to the NFL Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. The NFL Show is brought to you by Replenishing Care and Technologies. Make sure you check out their PMF machine at rcandt.com. I'm your co-host for the NFL Show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing great, Mike. How about you?
All right, and today we are going to talk about maybe the greatest decade in the history of Western civilization, the 1970s. And the top 10 players of the 1970s. And the 1970s are really where the NFL really started to transition into taking over for Major League Baseball as the most watched sport in the United States.
And I think it shows when you look at the decade. I mean, you look at some of the players and some of the teams that dominated. I mean, it's an iconic era, not just because this is not a team that made the foundation for football, but at the same point, this is what took it to another level. This is a group of players who really became kind of the golden generation, I guess you could say, of football players and kind of took the sport to a new level that just had never been at before.
All right, so Sam, start us off. What do you got at number 10?
Number 10 was the most difficult spot. Number 10, number 9, but I've got Ron Yeri. He was a right tackle on the Minnesota Vikings. I think he was a six-time first-team All-Pro. I'll pull up his numbers now. But he was on teams that were coached by Bud Grant. They ended up losing 3 Super Bowls, but they got there 3 times during his career with the Vikings. He was also on an offensive line that featured Mick Tingelhoff, Ed White. Those guys were both very talented players as well. And yeah, like I said, 6-time first-team All-Pro, 7 Pro Bowls. They all came in the 1970s. He gets my number 10 spot.
Yeah, and you bring up Ed White. He should be in the Hall of Fame also, I believe. He also played for the Air Coryell Chargers. Plus, he was on our show, or on our Legends show, like 4 or 5 years ago, and he's a really good guy. My number 10 is Earl Campbell. And while I know he only played 2 years in the 1970s, that 2-year run, he basically decimated defenses. And you could ask the Pro Football Hall of Fame. They placed him on the team of the 70s, the all-decade team, just off of those 2 years. And I think the case can be made that during those 2 years, 78 and 79, where he led the league in rushing both years, that he was the best player in pro football. He led the Oilers to 2 straight AFC championship appearances. And they lost both of them to the Pittsburgh Steelers. They weren't as good as the Steelers. But Dan Pastorini was the quarterback. He wasn't an above-average quarterback, but he wasn't a great quarterback. You had Bum Phillips as the head coach. But Earl Campbell, to me, the most iconic game in the 1970s, at least regular season-wise, had to be the 1978 Monday Night Football game against the Miami Dolphins, where they beat the Dolphins 35-30. And I can still hear the Houston Oilers fight song in my head from that night, and I Love You Blue. And it was, to me, the greatest Monday Night Football game ever played. So to me, number 10 is Earl Campbell.
Yeah, I can see why he did that, because Earl Campbell's guy, I mean, he was, I think, the league MVP in 1979. He won the rushing crown in 70 and 79. He was the Offensive Player of the Year both years. So I understand why he took that award. For me, 2 years, even though it was phenomenal 2 years, I just think 2 seasons is just too little put on a top 10 for a decade list.
Well, luckily, I don't care what you think. What do you have at number 9, Sam?
Number 9, he might be a little bit too low on the list, but I got Terry Bradshaw at number 9. And part of the reason for that is that he definitely struggled early on in his career. By the end of his career, he was a clutch quarterback, 4-time Super Bowl champion. He was a league MVP in 1978. So he accomplished quite a lot towards the end of the decade, but there at the beginning, it was a very rough start for him. I mean, in his rookie season, he threw 24 interceptions and only 6 touchdowns. So it took him a couple of years to get up the pace. Franco Harris and the running game really carried him during that time. So did the defense. By the end of the decade, Terry Bradshaw was one of the best quarterbacks the NFL had ever seen.
But how about this? You talked about Earl Campbell with just the 2 great years at the end of the 70s. You can make a case Terry Bradshaw was just that also. Because before that, they won the Super Bowls. You had Harrison Bleier. You had maybe the greatest defense of all time. You had Chuck Noll, who I think is an all-time great coach. I think he's top 5 at worst. So to me, I've only got one quarterback on my list. Bradshaw actually came in at number 11 on mine. And I think just for the sheer numbers and the way he played through the 70s, I mean, really, not until about 78 and 79, the Steelers transitioned. Their first 2 Super Bowls was won with defense. The second 2 Super Bowls, the defense was still great, but that offense all of a sudden became great. You had Swan and Stallworth. You still had Harrison Bleier. You had one of the great offensive lines at all time, anchored by Mike Webster in the center. So I've got him at number 11. I don't have him in my top 10, but I could see him as high as number 1 just because of the 4 Super Bowls. But to me, once again, there's just a couple years there where he was considered one of the best, if not the best, quarterbacks.
Yeah, I'd say 3 or 4 years where he was really, I would say top 3 quarterback in the NFL. But I think the 4 Super Bowls does, of course, give him a little bit of an edge over a guy like Earl Campbell.
But you can look at the first Super Bowl was 16-6, and I don't think he had a lot to do with that. Super Bowl 10, he played a little bit better, but that, like I said, wasn't the offense. But I can see where he's there. I could actually make a case for him to even be higher. I just don't have him there because I had a couple guys that I think people never think of that I wanted to put in. My number 9 is Franco Harris. So there you go. That's my concession right there. And I think the sheer productivity lands him on the list. He eclipsed 1,000 yards rushing in 7 of 8 seasons during the decade. And don't forget, and a lot of people forget this, most of those seasons were only 14 games. So 1,000 yards was a huge accomplishment. And to do it 7 out of 8 times, I think, really speaks to how great he was. And I think it makes his milestones even more difficult to accomplish. And, he did end his career, I think, number 1 or number 2. He got close to Walter Payton's rushing record. And the 1970s, 1972, the most famous play probably in NFL history, the Immaculate Reception, where he grabs the ball right before it hits the ground against the Raiders, races for a touchdown. That was, I think people forget, the Steelers' first ever playoff win in 1972 against the Oakland Raiders. And it sparked from 1972 up until probably the early 80s, one of the great rivalries in NFL history between the Steelers and the Raiders.
Yeah, I wish you could bring that rivalry back because that was a fun one to go back and learn about. I wish I could bring that back into the modern NFL. But Franco Harris, he went through the first 9 years of his career. He averaged 75.4 rushing yards per game. That's with the 1980 season where he's beat up and injured. So he was one of the best running backs during the decade. I just think that I've got 2 other running backs ahead of him on my list, and they're just so good that I couldn't slot Franco into the top 10.
Well, I've got 2 also, but it doesn't mean he's not one of the top 10 players.
That's fair. But I'm going to disagree with you on that.
1 or 2, which I'm going to get to here in a couple spots. The difference between that to me was just the longevity in the decade for Franco and the 1 Super Bowls, where the other guy, neither one of the other 2 had to 1 Super Bowls. So I think we're probably looking at the same 2 running backs listed ahead of him. All right. My number 8 is Larry Little. And there's a lot of choices to make here, offensive linemen during this period. Joe Delamalure, Dan Deerdorf, Mike Webster, all kind of guys. And the entire left side of the Raiders line. That being said, I think Little deserves the honor. He was a 5-time first-team All-Pro. But that Dolphins team also fielded what might have been the greatest ground attack in league history. From 1971 to 73, the Dolphins amassed almost 8,000 rushing yards, 14-game seasons again, remember. Easily the most in the NFL during that time. That's an average of close to 190 yards rushing per game. I think Little was arguably the best overall player on one of the most successful teams of all time. And I think Larry Little is a guy that most people wouldn't have on their list. Most people wouldn't even consider, Sam.
Well, you're right about that because I didn't have him on my list. I didn't consider him, so you got me on that one. I will throw it out there. What about someone like – I know he's more of a – might be remembered more for his play in the 1980s, but what about someone like John Hanna, who came in early in the 70s and kind of peaked or started peaking during the middle of the 70s? What about someone like him?
Well, I think Larry Little would be in the conversation also, or he would be in the conversation with Little also. And I think Hanna, when you go the vast time of his career, which went through the mid to late 80s, I think John Hanna was the greatest guard that ever lived. I think the best offensive lineman of the 70s, and I know I'll catch a lot of flack for this, was Little. If you watch him, he was dominant, and he was dominant on one of the greatest offensive lines at all time. And like I said, how many teams in history have averaged 190 yards rushing per game? So I think when you combine the 3 Super Bowls, winning 2 of them, with the fact that he was the anchor on maybe the greatest offensive line, if not the greatest offensive line, definitely top 5, top 10 all time, I think Little should be there. And once again, John Hanna gets a lot of credit. Larry Little doesn't. That's kind of why I lean towards Little here. That and the fact that John Hanna was a stud up through Super Bowl 20 team with the Patriots even.
You've got a little support in the comments section. Greg's here saying, good call, Mike, on Larry Little.
There. I like Greg. Greg's one of my favorites. Thank you, Greg.
Greg seems to agree a lot with you.
Oh, that's why I like Greg. That's my alter ego. I'm Greg. And once again, thanks, Greg, for listening. Who do you have at number 8, Sam?
Number 8, I have Ken Houston. You talk about players who often get forgotten. I think Ken Houston is in that conversation. He's the guy who came in and was already an impact player in his rookie season in 1967. And he just became better and better as the years went on. He played up until 1980. He retired with 12 Pro Bowls and 2 first-team All-Pro selections. So maybe I have him too high. Maybe he didn't have the peak that some of our defensive backs we talk about have. But I think you mentioned longevity with Franco Harris. I think Ken Houston is the definition of longevity as a defensive back. He finished his career with 49 interceptions and 9 defensive touchdowns. I think it was a pretty good career. Like I say, looking back, I might have him a little too high, but I think he's got the longevity to be in the top 10.
I don't think you do, because I have him at number 7. And I think when you look at him, he's kind of like the glory days of Bruce Springsteen's album Born in the USA in 1984. Everybody remembers Born in the USA, and they forget Glory Days is a really good song, though. And I think Houston really scared the daylights out of quarterbacks, and he's kind of the lost hit of the decade. And he's never mentioned among the Graham's greatest defensive players, but he was. I mean, he was a starter, listed as a starter on the team of the decade in 1970s. He also was the starter on the 75th anniversary team. So older people know what I'm talking about. This is a guy that was elected 12 Pro Bowls over the course of his career. And, I think that he had 9 or 10 pick sixes in his career. I mean, he was a dominant player from the safety position. I think a case can be made that he's the greatest safety to ever play the game.
I don't know if I was going as far as greatest safety to ever play the game, but I do agree with you.
Did you ever see him play? Sam, did you ever see him play?
No.
Okay, Greg agrees with me again. We're going to go ahead and put the comment up there since he does. So there you go. Greg Gorecki. Ken Houston was great. Maybe Greg needs to be my co-host. What do you have at number 7, Sam?
Number 7, I've got Jack Youngblood. We've talked about him a couple days ago. I forget what show it was, but we talked about him a little while ago. We talked about the best, defensive ends in NFL history. This guy, 7-time Pro Bowler, 5-time first-team All-Pro. All those selections came in the 1970s. He did play until the mid-1980s, but was trailing off a little bit by then. His best years came in the late 70s to mid-70s. Part of a good Rams team. I think Jack Youngblood is another player who I think everyone knows who he is based on because he's got a legacy of being one of those toughest players in NFL history. But I think he's a guy who's underrated as far as what he actually accomplished in his career.
All right. Number 6, Sam.
My number 6. Now, this is where another running back comes in. It's Walter Payton. He's only at number 6 because he didn't play.
We got the same number 6, by the way.
Oh, we do? All right. Well, that makes it much easier. But I was going to say, he's only at number 6. He missed, I think, the first 5 or 6 years of the decade. And his rookie season wasn't anything spectacular. It was really after that when he turned things up and became one of the greatest running backs of all time. He's 1977 MVP and Offensive Player of the Year. And when he retired in the, I guess you'd call it late 1980s, he was one of the best running backs of all time.
Yeah, and I think the game that stands out to me was the contest against Minnesota where he ran for 275 yards with flu-like symptoms. And I think people don't realize, everybody remembers the 1985 version of Walter Payton, but the 1970s Payton was different from the running back that people saw in the 80s. Early in his career, he had a violent running style. I mean, if you watch the film of him, there's times where you could see him breaking around the corner, and he'll actually cut back in to deliver a blow to a defensive player. I think for me, if I had to list the 5 greatest football players of all time, Walter Payton would be in that list. The only reason I have him down here at, where'd we have him, number 6, Sam?
Correct.
So the only reason I got him at 6 is really he didn't pick up to the last 4 years of the decade, 76, 77, 78, and 79. And once again, in 1977, the last year there was only 14 games played in the NFL, he ran for 1,852 yards. And I think when people look at the records pre-1980, I think they forget that up to a certain point, the league was only 12 games long. And then up until 1978, it was only 14 games long. So it makes what they did even bigger.
Yeah, it makes it even more impressive that he's still one of the rushing leaders all time because he did play in those era, or did start playing that era when it was only 14 games. I think people overlook just how dominant the early version of Walter Payton was.
All right, Greg Gorecki did retire after 36 years in broadcasting in January. Greg, if you ever want to make a comeback, just let me know. Because Sam's way young. But Sam did impress me. And, Greg, you got to admit, you were surprised Sam went with Ken Houston in the top 10 also.
I know a little bit. I spent some time researching. I know a little bit about NFL history.
All right. Well, I know you do, or you wouldn't be allowed on the show. Because we've had people that don't know anything before, and then they can't come on no more because they can't keep up. Number 5, I've got Alan Page. Little trivia. Sam, tell me right now, who are the only 2 defensive players who have earned NFL MVP honors? Lawrence Taylor in 1986, and who?
Alan Page.
That's why Alan Page is my number 5. And he was a dominant defensive tackle. He didn't make first team all decade, as you had Joe Green and Bob Lilly there also. And, those are 2 of the best guys that ever played a position. And I think you got Lilly only played 5 seasons in the decade. That's why I would have Page here instead of him. Page was a standout the entire 10 years. He played on those great Minnesota Viking teams during the 70s, went to the Super Bowl. I guess Super Bowl 4 would have been considered 69, but they went to 3 Super Bowls. And the only reason they lost those 3 Super Bowls wasn't because of anything they did. It's just they played teams in the Dolphins, Steelers, and Raiders who were just better than they were. So Alan Page to me is number 5, Sam.
I do have Alan Page on my list, but I've got him actually a little higher than you do. For now, at number 5, I've got another Steeler. I've got Jack Ham at 5. And the reason I don't have Jack Lambert, because I don't have Lambert on this list, the reason I don't have him competing with Ham is because Lambert kind of peaked a little bit later. I know he did win the 1976 Defensive Player of the Year award, but I think 4 of his 6 first-team All-Pro selections came in the 1980s. So Lambert had a little bit of a later peak, while Jack Ham, all of his first-team All-Pro selections, all 6 of them came in the 70s, which is why I got him at number 5. And he wasn't maybe recognized as he doesn't have the same mean streak as someone like Jack Lambert, but I think he was just as intelligent of a football player, and that shows his ability to cover and go out and get 32 career interceptions.
How about this? I have Jack Ham at number 4. And if ever anybody from that Steelers team can be considered underrated, it's Jack Ham. He made the Pro Bowl every season from 73 to 79. And he was first-team All-Pro in the final 6 years of that 7-year span. He picked off 28 passes from 1971 through the end of the decade. The thing about Jack Ham is this. The only outside linebacker I've ever seen that I would put in the company of Lawrence Taylor is Jack Ham. And I think Jack Ham was better in coverage than Taylor. Jack Ham was, to me, like I said, number 1 or number 2 outside linebacker of all time. The difference between him and Lambert was this. I think Ham was just as violent, but he was playing an outside linebacker where you got to use your brain a little bit more. Lambert was flying around smacking people. And I love Jack Lambert. I hate the Steelers, but my son, when he was like 5, I bought him a Jack Lambert jersey. But a lot of that was the toothless glare and smile you would get from Jack Lambert. People loved that. Jack Ham was more of a quiet, unassuming guy. But for my money, I may take Mean Joe Green before Jack Ham, but Jack Ham would be my second choice off of any of these Steeler teams in history. I mean, to me, Ham and Mean Joe Green are the 2 greatest Steelers that ever lived.
Yeah, I think people overlook Ham because of guys like Mel Blount and Lambert and Joe Green. Sometimes those guys draw more of the attention, and Ham kind of gets left behind, but he is an all-time great. He is one of the greatest linebackers anyone's ever seen.
All right, who do you have at number 4?
Number 4, I've got Roger Staubach, and I debated having him lower because I don't think Staubach was to the quarterback position what Jack Ham was to the linebacker position. I don't think Staubach revolutionized or changed the position or defined the position as much as Jack Ham did. But at the same point, 2 Super Bowl victories, 6 Pro Bowl selections. He's a Hall of Fame. He's an iconic player, one of the most iconic players of all time. And people forget, he didn't start playing in the NFL until he was 27 years old. So this guy had entered the league at 23 or 24. We could be talking about an entirely different player. But during the 1970s, he's one of the best quarterbacks, and I argue he could say he was more talented than Terry Bradshaw over a longer period of time.
How about this? If Roger Staubach would have entered the NFL in 1965 or whatever it would have been after playing at the Navy, maybe it changes everything in NFL history. Now, if he's a Dallas Cowboy then, maybe Vince Lombardi hadn't won as much. Maybe we're talking about Tom Landry when we compare Bill Belichick to somebody instead of Vince Lombardi. Because when you look at the Ice Bowl and you look at the championship game the year before that, which ended in a 34-27 loss where Meredith throws the interception at the end of the game in the end zone down at the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. I mean, I think it's easy to say that maybe Staubach would be the difference in winning those two games.
I think he would. I mean, Staubach, like you said, to have him this high on the list speaks to what I view his ability as. I think he would have been a difference maker for that team had he gotten there earlier.
Yeah, and I've got Staubach at number 3, actually. And I think the thing that separates him from guys like Bradshaw or Stabler was consistency. I mean, he had the highest NFC passer rating in 71, 73, 77, 78, and 79. I think Bradshaw presents the stiffest argument to this because he beat Dallas twice in the Super Bowl. But individually, when you look at Bradshaw, a lot of Bradshaw's better years were like 1980 and 81 when the Steelers were in decline. So when I look at this, Staubach won 84 regular season games in the decade of the 70s, which was the most by a quarterback at any position. They revolutionized the shotgun offense with Roger Staubach in Dallas. 1975, I think people forget that he took a Dallas Cowboy team to the Super Bowl that a lot of people thought was in a rebuilding mode, wouldn't even make the playoffs. They go in as a wild card. He throws the Hail Mary pass in 1975 at the end of the divisional playoff game against Minnesota to beat them. Then they go to L.A. to play the Rams, and that Rams team was a pretty good favorite going into that game. I think they'd beaten the Cowboys earlier in that year. And Staubach comes out, and Dallas just obliterates the Rams 37-7 in the championship game. He then, Super Bowl 12, that Dallas Cowboy team, I think, gets overlooked because everybody wants to concentrate on the Jimmy Johnson teams. But that Cowboys team in 77 with Dorsett, the Doomsday defense, Roger Staubach, I mean, that was a loaded team that basically decimated everybody in the playoffs. They beat the Bears and Walter Payton 37-7. In the NFC Championship game, they beat the Minnesota Vikings 23-6. And while it's true Bob Lee was the starting quarterback because Fran Tarkenton had been hurt, they still dominated a great Viking defense. And then they come out and play against the Orange Crush in Super Bowl 12 and totally dominate Denver 27-10. So I got Roger Staubach at number 3. And I think that if he would have had those extra 4 or 5 years, I think there's no doubt Staubach may finish as one of the top 5 quarterbacks in NFL history.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the biggest what-ifs thing we could say in the 1970s. How would it happen if, or I guess it wouldn't be the 70s, it would have been the 60s, but what if Staubach had arrived earlier? What if Staubach had taken a more normal route to the NFL? But we're moving on to my number 3. My number 3 is Alan Page, and we talked about him earlier. I think, like I said, I think he was more dominant as a defensive tackle than Staubach was as a quarterback. During the 70s, he had 5 first-team All-Pro selections, an MVP award, which for a defensive player, it was, I mean, that's just unheard of pretty much. Like I said, it's him and Lawrence Taylor. They're the only 2 guys who have ever done it. 9 total Pro Bowls throughout his career. I think 7 of them came in the 70s. So I think he's one of the most dominant defensive players of all time. I would personally take him over Randy White for our first-team All-Decade team. I know he ended up being second team, but I would take him Page over Randy White for first team.
All right. I think Randy White was a much better player than Page. I don't have him because the shortness of the 70s, but still, I don't know. I think it's a toss-up. I just think Page, for just this decade, was a little bit better. I really like Randy White, though. But White had a lot of good years in the early 80s up till about the mid-80s anyways. Who do you have at number 2, Sam?
My number 2, and I don't like putting him here because obviously he's a terrible person. We've seen a lot of bad things come up about him since he's retired, but O.J. Simpson's my number 2. And I think he has to have a spot on this list just because of how dominant he was for about a 5-year stretch where he led the league in rushing 4 times. He was a first-team All-Pro all 5 years. He won the 1973 MVP and Offensive Player of the Year awards. I think O.J. Simpson, for those 5 years, they're arguably 5 of the best years by a running back in NFL history, and that was during 14-game season. So I think he's got to be at least top 3 in this decade.
Yeah, I agree. I've got him at number 2 also. I debated put him at number 1. The guy I got at number 1, I think is the greatest to ever play his position, though. I think O.J. Simpson, he may be the greatest to ever play his position. Maybe that sorted off-field story is kind of the reason we drop him just a little bit even. But his run from 72 to mid-77 is a span of dominance that has only been rivaled to me by Eric Dickerson in the first 6 years of his career with the Rams. And he was the first running back to rush for over 2,000 yards in a season, and he did it in, once again, how many games, Sam?
14.
2 years later, he surpassed 1,800 yards again in how many games, Sam?
14.
During that 5.5-year period before his injury, he averaged 110 yards per game. He sustained a knee injury in 1977, which ultimately ended his career. He finished his career 78-79 with the San Francisco 49ers, where he had a game or two where he ran for 100 yards, but he was pretty much done after that. But the thing that people forget about O.J. Simpson is this is a guy that had to go through a junior college. He goes to USC. He gets drafted by the Bills. And really, his first year or two looked like he was going to be a bust. They actually talked about putting him at wide receiver. And when you fast forward into his career, I mean, this was a team where you knew they were going to run. You had the Electric Company, one of the greatest offensive lines of all time in front of him. But other than that, I mean, you had Joe Ferguson, who was a slightly above average quarterback. The defense was all right. But O.J. Simpson, in the 70s, I think the AFC was the most competitive conference of any decade that we've seen. You had the Raiders, the Dolphins, the Steelers. I mean, they were loaded. Even the Bengals, mid-70s, would win 10 or 11 games every year. And in 1974, he took the Bills to the playoffs pretty much single-handedly. They lost, I think it was like 32-14 to the Steelers in Pittsburgh. But O.J. Simpson was a one-man wrecking crew. And the only thing you can wonder is what happens. I mean, he's similar to Walter Payton in the 70s, where Walter Payton in the mid-70s or mid to late 70s, there's no running game there or no passing game there. The defense is all right, but not great. And Walter Payton took the Bears to the playoffs in 77 when they got beat 37-7 by the Cowboys. He takes them in 79. They lose the wild card game 27-17 to the Philadelphia Eagles. So O.J. Simpson, Walter Payton, a lot of comparisons there where they could just, even as a running back, they could put a team on their back and just carry the team to at least close to the finish line.
Oh, yeah, and it's a tale we've seen multiple times, even since then. Just put a more modern comparison, you might not love this, but Adrian Peterson, the MVP season he had, he carried the Vikings to the playoffs and they lost in the first round to the Green Bay Packers. But we've seen it. The all-time great running backs are capable of dragging their teams almost single-handedly to the playoffs, and O.J. Simpson certainly did that.
Well, Barry Sanders did it too. And we talked a little bit about Eric Dickerson. And if you want to do the 80s tomorrow, we can actually talk about Dickerson probably also because I think he would be on there. And Dickerson in the 80s, you look at the 85 team, you had an injured Dieter Brock. Dickerson comes out against the Cowboys, runs for like 248 yards, which was a postseason record at the time. Don't know if it still is or not. They beat the Cowboys 28-0, but then they run into the Bears in Chicago. So Dickerson was also that kind of guy. And when you look at that, maybe the difference in why we rate Jim Brown so high and maybe rank him over these guys is the fact that Jim Brown, you know, had a quarterback. He had a defense. They had great players around him. Maybe that's why we rank Jim Brown in front of guys like O.J. Simpson and Barry Sanders and Eric Dickerson, Walter Payton.
Well, it certainly helped him out a bit. I mean, he came in there, and he, like you said, he had a team around him where he was able to win games, unlike these other guys we were talking about who really were the one-man wrecking crews. But at the same point, Jim Brown dominated the position in a way no one else ever has. I think there was only 1 year in his career where he didn't lead the league in rushing yards. I think Jim Brown, it's not just the winning. There's a lot of other factors that go into why he's rated number one.
All right, so I'm assuming we've got the same number one because as a Steelers fan, if you don't have this guy in the top 10, you should turn in your Steelers card if that's what they give you to be a Steelers fan. Who do you have at number one?
It's Mean Joe Green. It has to be the greatest defensive tackle of all time. And of course, he arrived in 1969, but after that, of course, all the way through the 70s, he retired in 1981, was there for all 4 Super Bowls, a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, 10 Pro Bowls, 4-time first-team All-Pro. I mean, it's just dominance personified. That's what he was. He was great. He revolutionized the position. I couldn't think of anyone else to put at number one.
Well, and I think this. I know they were 1 and 13 and 69, but when people talk about Lawrence Taylor and how in 1981 he completely changed the Giants, I think Mean Joe Green and Chuck Noll were the same thing with the 69 Steelers. Steelers had never won a playoff game up till 69 or up till 72, and they go from 1 and 13 and 69 to 5 and 9 and 70, 6 and 8 and 71, and Green was invited to the Pro Bowl in both seasons. In 1972, Pittsburgh finished 11 and 3, won its first divisional title. They win that Immaculate Reception game. But I think the one thing people forget is this. They almost beat that undefeated Dolphins team. That was back when they used to rotate divisions on who would host the game. And if you look at 1972, actually in the divisional playoffs, the Cleveland Browns only lost by I think 6 or 7 points to Miami at Miami. And then Miami goes up to Pittsburgh, wins 21-17. And that's the game where Bob Greasy had to come into the game to save the day when Earl Morrall couldn't finally get the job done.
Yeah, I think we talked about the other day, and it really came down to Pittsburgh couldn't throw the ball that game. Terry Bradshaw struggled. They brought in a backup quarterback to come play as well because Terry Bradshaw couldn't get the job done. 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. If you gave Pittsburgh a better offense in, I'll say, 70, 71, 72 to kind of match what their defense was building up to, I think they would have had a lot more wins in those early years.
Well, how about this? I also think that Mean Joe Green played the greatest game in Super Bowl history for a defensive player. Against Mick Tingelhoff, I think it was Super Bowl 9. Green is a defensive tackle, intercepted a pass, forced a fumble, and, he had a fumble recovery, and he was absolutely dominant against Mick Tingelhoff, who's a Hall of Famer. And Pittsburgh limited the Vikings to only 119 total yards of offense. They held them to 17 yards on the ground. And the thing about this is Green missed 4 games in 1975 due to a pinched nerve, which snapped a streak of 91 consecutive games. And when you look at this, that injury, he hurt his back, I think, in 76. Without injuries, I think by the time this guy was done, everybody would realize what we're saying right now. In the 1970s, the best football player that ever lived during that decade, to me, hands down, is Mean Joe Green.
Yeah, because he had a streak of 3 consecutive first-team All-Pro selections before that 75 season, and then, of course, 76 as well. So if he stayed healthy the entire time, I think we'd be looking at a guy who would have 5 or 6 first-team All-Pro nods.
All right. I was waiting to see if Greg agreed with our number 1 pick or not. But tomorrow, do you want to do 1980s?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. Maybe we can do the top 10 Super Bowl commercials of the 90s after that. I'm just kidding. But all right. Tomorrow, 1 o'clock Eastern, you can watch me and Sam debate the top 10 players of the 1980s. Number 1 will be Anthony Munoz. Number 2, Boomer Esiason. Number 3, James Brooks. Number 4, Chris Collinsworth. But Sam, tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Sam_Teets33. Constantly post new articles and content there every day, so feel free to go check that out.
All right, guys, you can find me at Grueling Truth. You can also go to our Facebook page, like that, watch our videos, read our articles, and you can find all of our articles on thegruelingtruth.com, also all of our shows, and on the old podcasting platforms. You can find us everywhere, and I do mean anywhere that you can find podcasts. And Greg Gorecki, here we go. I like Greg. I mean, we'll have to ask Greg if he wants to be on the show tomorrow to break down the top 10 1980 guys, but then that'll take away a listener.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Greg seems to know his stuff, though. I think he deserves a spot if he wants it.
All right, so Greg, if you want to sit in for Sam tomorrow, and then we'll let Sam just type comments in while we do the show.
Hold on.
You don't like that?
Hey.
All right. And really, real quick, I want to give a shout out. My high school football team, we played our first game, won 47-0. So there you go.
Yeah, so we were
like the steel curtain. They ran 43 plays for 20 yards.
Hey, I saw on Facebook. That's dominant win, Mike. Congrats.
There you go. So hopefully we make it 2 this week. All right, guys, make sure you hear all of our podcasts on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify. Wherever you find podcasts, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So remember, replenishing care and technologies at rcandt.com. So for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.